Dracula, Crowley, Evil Morty, these aren't the kind of names that scream doing it for the greater good. They're definitely villains, but in a way, they're kind of right. Here are even more TV show villains who did bad stuff for good reasons. Netflix's critically acclaimed adaptation of Konami's Castlevania video game series is a masterclass in compelling villains. Every antagonist in the show is interesting, from the power-hungry vampire queen Carmilla and the manipulative necromancer Hector to the severely cynical Isaac. Many of the best storylines and conflicts in Castlevania come from the dynamics in this rogues gallery. While they each have intriguing arcs, they orbit around the core villain of the show, Dracula. At the start of the show, Dracula is portrayed as a recluse. His centuries upon centuries of murder and conquest eventually left him aimless, closing the doors of his magical castle and living a hermit's life. That all changes when a woman from a nearby village named Elisa knocks on his front door and asks to read through his libraries of seemingly endless scientific knowledge. She aspires to be a doctor, so she can help the helpless. Blown away by her generosity, Dracula allows her to stay and eventually falls in love with her. They marry and have a son together, but their familial happiness is torn asunder when agents of the church condemn Lisa for witchcraft and burn her at the stake.
Don't hurt them! They don't understand!
Who's she talking to?
I believe she's exhorting Satan.
Thus begins Dracula's genocidal war against the human race. It's an indefensible campaign, but it starts from a deeply sympathetic place. Is Dracula right to want all humans dead? No. Is he right to believe their institutions corrupt and their leaders greedy and violent? Oh yeah. Game of Thrones generally isn't the show to watch if you're looking for sympathetic villains. The series is littered with the most despicable characters you can imagine, from sadistic monsters like Joffrey Baratheon and Ramsay Bolton to supernatural forces of evil like the Night King. However, some antagonists in the HBO fantasy saga deserve the benefit of the doubt, and a lot of them live north of the Wall. The Wildlings are introduced as savage, lawless renegades who mock the authority of Westeros's great houses and live to steal and murder. There are certainly some unsavory figures among the Wildling ranks. Looking at you, Rattleshirt, but most of them are just ordinary folk who'd rather live freely than pay tribute to the continent's arrogant lords and ladies. Mans Raider, the so-called King Beyond the Wall, is a level-headed man who does what he believes is necessary to protect his people in a brutal place. Most of his ill deeds are spurred by his devotion, which, given how quickly people can die in lands of the White Walkers, is admirable.
I don't want people to remember me like that, scorched and screaming. But it's better than betraying everything I believe.
The Wildlings' desire to avoid the royals of Westeros is also super understandable. Time and again, the heirs of the great houses prove that they're far more interested in hoarding their spoils than protecting their own citizens. Mans is a better leader than most of them, and he's honest about his darkest side too. The whole timeline of Avatar: The Last Airbender is filled with morally gray characters, people who, for one reason or another, allow their good beliefs to be taken too far. This is especially true in The Legend of Korra, in which Avatar Korra must constantly weigh equally questionable sides in different global conflicts. Korra's first brush with villainy comes in the form of Amon, the leader of an anti-bending faction called the Equalists. They believe that non-benders have been oppressed for most of history and deserve equal status with benders. The goal is pure, and the Equalists are justified in their frustrations. Republic City is run by a council of representatives from the bending nations. Pro-bending athletes are deified, and dangerous street gangs of benders regularly terrorize ordinary citizens. Amon, who is revealed to be a bloodbender in disguise, takes things way too far. But some positive effects of the Equalist movement can be seen later in the series, like the public election of a non-bender president of Republic City. In Season 3, Korra encounters another villain who leans just a little too far to the dark side, Zaheer. A devoted anarchist, Zaheer believes that most of the evil in the world is systemic, caused by corrupt leaders and governments. His theory is pretty strongly supported by how the show paints characters like the Earth Queen, and some of the people he fights are objectively foul. Like Amon, Zaheer takes his philosophy a little too far and ultimately falls out of balance. In the show's final season, however, he finds some redemption by aiding Korra in her healing process. When the protagonists are criminals and the antagonists are trying to bring them to justice, titles like hero and villain can get tricky. You wouldn't call Hank Schrader of Breaking Bad a villain any more than you'd call Walter White a hero. Sometimes, though, the lawman dips just far enough into questionable territory that you start rooting for the crime boss instead. That's often the case in The Sopranos, particularly when it comes to FBI Chief Frank Cubitoso. Cubitoso is a frequent thorn in the side of Tony Soprano, undertaking various wiretapping schemes and other plans to nail the mafioso once and for all. These ploys often end with collateral damage, like when Christopher's longtime partner Adriana was discovered to be a mole and executed on Tony's orders. Does that kind of messy operation really make Cubitoso a villain? No. He was still trying to take down an objectively evil person and a dangerous organization, and he wasn't the one who had Adriana killed. Still, it's that kind of gray area that makes Cubitoso a perfect example of his archetype. From Hank Schrader to Frank Cubitoso to Roy Petty in Ozark, the troubled and antagonistic agent of the law is a standard of the crime genre. Whether they're heroes, villains, or somewhere in the middle is largely left up to the audience. Watching Rick and Morty, you can count on a lot of rewarding resolutions. Seemingly one-off plot lines are often brought back whole seasons later. Nothing is ever forgotten in the Adult Swim series, leaving endless possibilities for callbacks and long-awaited twists. One of the longest and most important payoffs in the show follows the plot of Evil Morty, a Morty from an alternate reality who first appears in Season 1. As the series progresses, Evil Morty is revealed to be behind a number of secret plots that help him to garner great power and influence over the Citadel of Ricks. In the finale of Season 5, Evil Morty's full plan is revealed. He discovers the Central Finite Curve, an isolated subset of universes where Rick is the smartest person in the cosmos, created by the Ricks of the multiverse. Evil Morty explains that infinite realities exist outside of the curve, in which Rick is of little importance, and all that he wants is to make a way out of the loop. He may commit murder here and there in order to reach that point, but it's hard not to root for Evil Morty at least a little bit. He grew sick of being forced into a second fiddle position by someone else's will, and he did whatever was necessary to achieve true freedom.
That's what makes me evil, being sick of him. If you've ever been sick of him, you've been evil too.
Saul Goodman, or Jimmy McGill, depending on where you are in the Better Call Saul timeline, isn't quite a villain, but he certainly isn't a hero. He exists in the morally dubious zone inhabited by so many of the franchise's characters. His brother Chuck is a bit of a different story. He's an upstanding lawyer with a deep respect for societal rules, who does everything in his power to keep his little brother from succeeding in the legal field. In the context of Better Call Saul, Chuck pretty clearly occupies the antagonist role. He presents numerous blockades to his brother's career path and is occasionally quite brutal to him. He definitely steps over the line from caution into cruelty at times. Yet his original motivations for these actions are pretty understandable. Jimmy spent much of his life as an untrustworthy conman, making numerous decisions that eroded his brother's faith in him as a person. Since Chuck is a respected lawyer himself, it makes sense that Jimmy's shortcuts into the field make him so angry. His doubts are justified, and a good deal of his behavior is as well. Still, it's hard not to hate Chuck. He's far from the most detestable character in the series, but his sympathetic starting point eventually gives way to him becoming a proper villain. The Marvel Cinematic Universe's second attempt at a Disney Plus series gave us The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, a globe-trotting spy thriller following Sam Wilson and Bucky Barnes. The miniseries delivered some exciting action and a handful of solid character moments for its two leads, but it was unfortunately dragged down by a number of writing and pacing problems. Complex issues like racial discrimination, social justice, and classism are all broached in the series, but sadly aren't treated with the depth or deftness they require. The Falcon and the Winter Soldier at least succeeds at delivering a uniquely sympathetic villain in Karli Morgenthau, the leader of the Flag Smashers. Labeled as a terrorist group by international authorities, the Flag Smashers are a faction of self-labeled Robin Hood types powered up on black market super soldier serum. The group mostly consists of young adults who experienced immense trauma in the wake of Thanos' snap. They disagree with post-blip political policies that would leave a lot of refugees and vulnerable communities out to dry. Karli leads a violent campaign to dissuade the world leaders from enacting such practices, and though she certainly makes a few bloody mistakes along the way, her motivations are pure. She cares about the downtrodden and is willing to do whatever it takes to defend them.
But Sam, what if I'm making the world a better place?
It's not a better place if you're killing people, it's just different.
The fire that is the Clone Wars is lit by Sith Lords Darth Sidious and Count Dooku, two objectively evil characters whose primary motivation is the accumulation of power. The conflict they ignite casts a shadow over the entire Star Wars galaxy, causing violence for years on end. However, most of the people involved with the Separatist cause aren't Sith. In fact, they don't even know much about Sidious's true plan. There are other irredeemable villains in their ranks for sure, but some of those who take up arms against the Republic actually have good reasons for doing so. Take for instance the Season 4 episode A Friend in Need, which follows Ahsoka Tano during a series of peace talks between Republic and Separatist representatives on Mandalore. Though these representatives don't get much screen time, the episode showcases the regular faces of the Separatists, leaders who simply want their planets to be free from Republic rule. Throughout the series, there are numerous examples of how everyday galactic citizens have been forgotten or abandoned by the Republic, like the Martez sisters in Season 7. Even the Jedi abandon their old ways of helping the helpless to serve as generals in the war. That's all to say that there are plenty of valid reasons for people to want freedom from the Republic, even if the overall Separatist movement is co-opted by the main villains. The live-action Marvel shows that initially premiered on Netflix have been heralded as some of the comic book company's best adaptations to date, with series like Daredevil, Jessica Jones, and The Punisher all getting particular praise. Luke Cage was another big hit in the Defenders franchise, and while Mike Colter did a strong job as the bulletproof hero, the show's most interesting characters were often its villains. Mahershala Ali's Cornell Cottonmouth Stokes is an obvious standout, but he's not the bad guy we're talking about today. Instead, it's Cornell's cousin, Mariah Stokes Dillard, who toes the line between true villain and sympathetic, well-intentioned antagonist. Mariah is a complicated person, to say the least. As a child, she suffered from constant abuse, raised in a household where violence was a common occurrence. She believes that iron-fisted rule is necessary for neglected communities like hers because no real help is ever coming from the outside world. To be fair, a good bit of that belief is based in hard truth. Ultimately, Mariah falls into more villainous habits, but her behavior is shaped by a traumatic life and an obsession with accumulating and maintaining strength. She's frequently sympathetic, and sometimes she's just straight up right. Netflix's Cobra Kai introduces a lot of fresh new characters to the world of the Karate Kid, adding a multi-generational flair to the cast of returning stars. One of those newcomers is Tory Nichols, who quickly becomes one of Cobra Kai's sensei John Kreese's best students and the sworn rival of Daniel LaRusso's daughter Samantha. Over the course of the show, Sam and Tory fight several times, with the latter adopting more and more aggressive behavior and morally corrupt tendencies. Tory is corrupted by the tainted teachings of John Kreese, but she also causes plenty of trouble on her own. While her penchant for violence isn't fully excusable, it is complicated by the nature of Tory's life. She lives in a small apartment with her little brother and her mother, who's constantly sick and therefore unable to work. Both rely solely on Tory and government checks to stay fed and healthy. She works multiple jobs to support her family while still attending high school, and she has to deal with constant harassment from people like her grimy landlord. It's no wonder then that Tory sees Sam, a privileged know-it-all from a wealthy family, as a villain worthy of hatred. After all, Sam is pretty rotten to her from the start, even falsely accusing Tory of thievery simply because she behaves somehow less than proper. AMC's Into the Badlands is a psychedelic blend of high-intensity martial arts action and post-apocalyptic political drama. As you might expect, that unique fusion results in a number of ethically murky characters, as every warrior of the titular Badlands has their own personal ambitions and motivations. One of the more enigmatic characters in the series is the Master, the powerful leader of an order of warriors dedicated to controlling the dark powers available to some humans. In the show, a handful of individuals are born with supernatural powers that activate when they bleed. Because these people can be incredibly violent and uncontrollable in their activated state, the Master believes it's necessary to keep them contained. To that end, she sends agents out into the world to apprehend affected people and temporarily block their abilities, taking them back to her monastery where they can be properly trained. That all sounds well and good until you learn that when the Master's guests fail to learn control, she locks them into long-term comas against their will. The Master has good intentions, but she acts as the absolute authority on right and wrong, which ultimately turns her into one of the series' primary villains. Her methods are understandable, but they're also undeniably invasive and extreme. Netflix's Arcane, an adaptation of the popular video game League of Legends, takes place in a grim fantasy world oozing with danger, dark magic, and underworld crime. The main villain of Season 1 is a man named Silco, a crime lord from the Undercity near Piltover. In times past, the Undercity was part of a sovereign nation called Zon, but leading up to the events of Arcane, it existed as a sort of lower-class subsidiary of the glamorous Pitover. Silco believed the land he was born on deserved to be free once again, and he fought in a resistance movement against the oppressor. Over time, however, Silco lost faith in doing things the right way and resorted to much more nefarious means. Those dark methods mostly come in the form of Shimmer, a dangerous and fiercely addictive drug manufactured by Silco's head scientist, which transforms humans into more powerful and monstrous forms. He conceives of the concoction as a means to claim power over the Undercity from his old friend turned rival Vander. Ultimately, Silco's plan is to use his army of monsters to threaten Piltover into granting Zaun its independence, which nearly works. Silco is clearly a deeply corrupted man by the time Arcane Season 1 starts, but the core motivations behind his criminal activity are somewhat defensible. In his own twisted way, he deeply cares about the Undercity and the people under his protection, like Jinx.
I never would have given you to them. Not for anything.
To be fair, Omar Little isn't really a villain in The Wire. He's an anti-hero at worst, and he's frequently the one the audience is rooting for, thanks to his campaign against violent drug dealers and his Robin Hood persona. Still, Omar is a loose cannon who operates above the law and undertakes a good deal of his thievery for personal gain. In many ways, The Wire is a show about how people are ultimately shaped by their environment. Characters like Avon Barksdale and Stringer Bell do horrible things, but they were raised in a place that taught them there was no other way. It's the same for Frank Sabatica, who makes tough calls for the overall good of the people in his community. These characters own their choices and their mistakes, but it would be a lie to say that they weren't guided by forces beyond their control. Omar's like that too, but rather than buying into some pre-existing system, he chooses to live fully by his own code. He takes what he wants, distributes it to those in need, well, most of the time, and dishes out his version of justice without hesitation or debate. He's a criminal, sure, but he's also fiercely independent and uncompromising. It's hard to find fault with Omar's philosophy or the way he handles his business, even when that business is bloody. Morgana Pendragon is dealt a rough hand in BBC's Merlin. Played exquisitely by Katie McGrath, Morgana is the illegitimate child of Uther Pendragon. She experiences the opposite of a redemption arc, going from one of Merlin's truest allies to one of his most dangerous foes. Her decline from hero to villain is far from simple, however, and Morgana has good reason for losing trust in the right side. Because she's magical and because Uther believes all magic to be evil, Morgana is forced to live in fear of herself for much of her life. She's compelled to hide, lie, and run to escape the harsh repercussions of her own natural abilities.
I just want to be myself. I don't want to be alone anymore.
She suffers several challenges as a result, but none worse than her ultimate betrayal at the hands of Merlin himself. Merlin attempts to kill Morgana because he believes it's the only way to stop a dangerous spell unwittingly carried by her. The situation is far from simple, but that doesn't make Morgana's full turn against the agents of Camelot any less understandable. Morgana slowly becomes the villain in her own story, but the way she gets there is tragic, and the supposed good guys she eventually sets herself against do plenty of wrong themselves. She's the definition of a sympathetic villain, as she was justified in many of her deeds. The universe of Firefly is inspired by the American Wild West, which is made clear in both the show's style and the behavior of its characters. Most of the planets that Captain Malcolm Reynolds and the crew of Serenity land on are in the far reaches of human settlement, and as such, they aren't exactly brimming with luxury. Quite to the contrary, the Firefly universe is a cutthroat place, where survival comes first and everybody is working some kind of angle. That doesn't necessarily make them villains though. After all, the alternative to taking advantage of someone is getting taken advantage of yourself. From that perspective, it's hard to see the con woman Saffron as an actual villain. Sure, she swindles, robs, and generally perplexes Mal and his crew several times during the show's brief run, but that's just how she makes her way through the cosmos. Unlike some of the other characters on this list, Saffron isn't an extremist who takes her ideology too far or a troubled person who's pushed to the side of evil. She's just a woman who plays the hand she's dealt, and it's hard to fault her for doing so. The CW's Supernatural is rife with witches, demons, and creatures of the apocalypse. No matter how you slice it, the vast majority of those characters fall squarely into the villain category. It would be hard to put the label of hero on a man whose actual title is King of Hell. So we're lucky that Mark Shepard's Crowley is just as deliciously evil as that title sounds. From his first appearance in Supernatural, Crowley quickly became a highlight of the show's expansive recurring cast. His stark sense of style and snide demeanor set him apart from other characters, and his role as an on-again, off-again ally to the Winchester brothers put him in a uniquely fun position in the story.
So this really necessary? When I've been inside your brother, we're practically family.
With Crowley, you never really know what you're going to get, as he keeps his plans very close to the chest. He's likable and endlessly entertaining, but is that the same thing as being right? Look at it this way. In the world of Supernatural, good and evil are never quite black and white. There are villains in heaven and heroes in hell. While Crowley has done enough bad in his time to earn himself the villain moniker, he's also just playing the game. He's a complicated person with a difficult past, and he does what's necessary to stay on top and keep his world in order. Another character whose villain status is debatable, Shane Walsh of The Walking Dead, is a far cry from the sadist who appeared later on in the show's run. Compared to characters like Negan and the Governor, Shane seems downright heroic. But he also represents the show's first major instance of humans becoming bigger antagonists than the undead themselves. Yes, Shane does some reprehensible things. He kills and lies to protect himself, he exhibits frighteningly violent and possessive behavior toward the rest of the group, and he's prone to fits of anger that are usually driven by selfish motivations. And yet, considering him in the context of later Walking Dead seasons, it's hard not to sympathize with Shane. He saw the coming storm in a way that most other characters, including Rick, didn't. How would the group have fared against the likes of Negan if Shane was still around? Would they have been tougher and more willing to make difficult decisions? Would those habits have ended up saving lives? There's no way to know for sure, just as there's no portrait of Shane that's either fully good or fully terrible. It's the gray areas that make The Walking Dead so compelling, and Shane is a perfect example. Check out one of our newest videos right here. Plus, even more Looper videos about your favorite TV shows are coming soon. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell so you don't miss a single one.